Back on In Montreal, your connection to Montreal's Jewish community. Time now to talk about a very well-respected and extremely talented colleague of ours who lost his life to lung cancer about a year and a half ago. Daniel Feist, he documented it, and here's more now with Anne Lang on In Montreal.
Thanks, Mark. Well, you may remember a few years ago, the Gazette published a very powerful series of articles by a man named Daniel Feist. At the time, he was battling cancer, and he wrote about how he dealt with it in a very open and honest way. Well, in February 2005, at the age of 51, Daniel died from the cancer, but a very close friend of his, Stan Shatenstein, decided that he wanted people to still be able to read those articles. So he put together this book called Cancer, My Story, and Stan is here to talk about it. Thank you for coming on to the show.
My pleasure.
So, Stan, I understand that it was your suggestion that Daniel write this series of articles. Why did you suggest that?
Well, Daniel had written something that I use in the preface of the book where he was complaining about something to the Gazette, and he had his usual passion, even though he was very sick and he was already starting to deal with treatment. I said, you know, Daniel, you have so much to say. Why don't you consider writing about your experience? And I was concerned at the time that, you know, maybe it was too personal, maybe it was too intimate, it invaded privacy. I said that, you know, perhaps he would just want to be in a cocoon with his family. But he really jumped on the idea. You could almost see the light bulb go off over his head. It was like, no, he had something to say. He had something to express to people. And, you know, he literally hit the ground running and was writing when he was very sick, going through treatments, but he wanted to do it.
Yeah. He certainly did hit the ground running. I'm going to read some of it just to give people a refresher of Daniel's writing and what it was like. This is called 25 Camels Iced the Cake, and it was published in the Gazette on September 9th, 2004. And this is where Daniel's talking about smoking, and he says, "To be honest, I've only basically stopped. It's almost unfathomable, but following a stage 4 lung cancer diagnosis, a surgery to remove a malignant tumor on my brain, and major lung surgery fast approaching, I'm a cheater. My wife, Susie, is finding out only as she reads these words, but on many occasions since my brain surgery, after she's gone to bed, I've slipped out of the house and walked to Dunkin' Donuts down the street, where there's always a gathering. I've befriended one grandmother who sells me 2 cigarettes for $1. I smoke one of them as I walk back home, inhaling only half the time. The other cigarette I'd hold on to for the next afternoon. It's crazy, but it's true." Now, that's very frank, and he's very frank throughout the entire process, talking about an inability to pee after surgery, talking about, you know, a diminished sex drive. How was he able to be so open?
It was just Daniel. That was who he was. He was out there. He was a friend to everyone, and he could sometimes be quarrelsome. He was opinionated. He just, you know, he didn't have the filter that most people have that, well, maybe I shouldn't say that in polite company. And he liked to provoke. I mean, he liked to press buttons. In fact, we spoke often, and if the conversation was too pleasant, he would say something provocative just to bother me. You know, we'd be discussing a subject where we basically had the same point of view, but he'd just take an opposite position just to get a rise out of me. And then his great pleasure would be, I knew I could get you to react. So, you know, he got a reaction from this. The thing about the smoking, it was terribly honest. He fought with it for years. And to say, you know, I sneak out at night and I only smoke half the cigarette and I only inhale half the time, it's a perfect representation of his ambivalence about the smoking. How much he was addicted. Smokers are very addicted. And he smoked heavily. And yet at the same time, you know, he just couldn't not admit this is what he did. Some people were very supportive, understanding how honest he was and knowing how tough it was to quit. And a few people, you know, wrote this guy who's suffering from lung cancer, chastising him. You know, how can you smoke? How can you do this? You know, you've got to get well. And they didn't understand that this is just who Daniel was, a good man, an addicted smoker, and he was admitting honestly how he handled things. And it was beautiful.
And you include some of the responses in the book, some of the letters that people wrote, hundreds of emails. How did Daniel react to that response?
He had that bemused quality. Often when you see somebody pull somebody from a burning building and they say, well, I was just doing my job, or you know that the person's done something extraordinary. And Daniel couldn't help himself. He had to be that open. But people understood, you know, they used the word courage, courageous in almost every email. And he's like, what? What's this? I just wrote some stories. But you know, sadly, that cancer touches so many people. And yet most people don't write articles in the newspaper, and they don't expose themselves and their families and their weaknesses, you know, and their shortcomings and their arguments with their children and all the things that he talked about so unfiltered. like the cigarettes, totally unfiltered. But that was Daniel's way.
How do you think he'd like to be remembered?
Just for who he was. He absorbed life. He was curious. He was bright. He was creative. He loved music. Music was his universal language. He knew it technically. He knew it passionately. So many people, loved what he had to say about it and loved what he shared because he conveyed that passion. You asked me about the letters, and so many people thanked him for his honesty about his story, but so many said, "You were the best music teacher I ever had," because he had taught at Concordia and Dawson, I believe. He had taught courses for several years, and he conveyed that passion for music. So he wanted to be remembered for that, as a loving father and as a good friend.
Well, I'll remember him as one of the best teachers I've ever had because he was my teacher at Concordia. But I want to ask you finally, now you've put this book together, all his columns, and you've also included factual information about cancer and all sorts of statistics. What do you want people to take away from this book?
Daniel was my closest friend. We went back to age of 9, and that's a very long time ago. And I work professionally dealing with tobacco control, dealing with the cost of smoking on a global scale. But Daniel was my friend. He didn't fail to be my friend because he smoked. It was just a problem between us. But I, loved him as a friend. And he put a human face on what smoking does to people. And to me, that's a legacy of the book. It's a tribute to my friend. It touches his friends, his family, but it's a good book for everyone because so many people are touched by cancer and by a human story. But for me, Daniel is the human face of the destruction wrought by the tobacco industry on people, and I'm very proud of my involvement in the book just for that, for how it tells Daniel's story and puts a human face to the suffering.
Thank you very much. Stan Shatenstein is my guest, co-author of Cancer, My Story. And you can find it in most major bookstores, and it can also be bought online. More in Montreal coming up. Stick around.